I wanted to take just a few minutes to introduce our guest, Lysley Tenorio, with some of... Thank you. Thank you for making him feel welcome. A little bit about his background, just the very short version. He earned his master's in fine arts from the University of Oregon. He has a whole bunch of fellowships and awards that he's won along the way as people recognize what an amazing writer he is. One of them is the Stegner Fellowship, which is at Stanford. A fellowship is usually where they pay you to just do your thing, which in this case is writing. Was that 2 years?
2 years.
Yeah, 2 years at Stanford, just where they paid him to take some time and do his writing. And also a little organization you might have heard of, the National Endowment for the Arts, also honored him. His first book, Monstress, got a lot of acclaim from the San Francisco Chronicle, elsewhere, and for those of you who aren't seniors, it is a core text in the senior class identity literature, which is how some of these fine folks know about it. Mr. Tenorio was born in the Philippines. He currently lives in San Francisco. He is a professor of English and creative writing at St. Mary's College here on our side of the bay. And he is working on his next book, which is a novel. Take it away.
Okay. Thanks so much. Hi, everybody. Hi. How are you? Good. I'll assume that was all good. Thanks so much for coming. Thank you, Sarah, for teaching the book. I appreciate it. And thank you to her class for reading it. I know you had to read it, but I appreciate you reading it anyway. And thank you to the rest of you for coming. I understand this is your free period, and you can do whatever you want. Sarah said you even have the opportunity to hang out with chickens, so that I'm more popular than the chickens for today is a good boost to my ego. So thanks for coming out. I'm hoping mostly that my time up here can be a conversation. I understand some of you have questions about the book, about the stories, or about writing. So I would very much like a lot of this to be a conversation. But I thought I might start with maybe just talking about how this book came to be, why I decided to pursue, of all the things in the world to pursue, why I decided to pursue writing. And then I thought I might read a little bit from a story called Super Assassin. And then hopefully we'll have a good conversation after that. But first, I wanted to talk about how I became a writer. I mean, I know a lot of you are in you're all in high school, and you're getting ready. You're thinking about college. And I'm sure people are thinking, what am I going to pursue in college, and how is that going to lead to my career? So I really came to writing in a kind of roundabout way. I wasn't one of those writers who was writing novels at the age of 10 years old, and I certainly know writers who are like that. I really came to writing relatively late in life. As a kid, I did love to read. I especially loved comic books. I was a DC guy, so don't hold that against me. But Justice League is coming out. So I was a big reader as a kid, but writing was not something that I was necessarily interested in. I did well in my English classes in junior high and high school, and I was an English major in college. But I went to UC Berkeley, and for most of my time there, I had no idea what I wanted to do with my life. Then I took a class on the history of the short story, taught by a writer named Bharati Mukherjee. Good answer. She was an Indian American writer who was giving a lecture class on the history of the short story. I was basically taking this class as a requirement just to graduate. And then I found out that my professor, Bharati Mukherjee, was also a writer. And I thought, that's kind of cool. She teaches, but she also writes books. I'd never met a writer in real life. I grew up in Mira Mesa, which is this little community in San Diego. And there was not a literary community there, so I'd never met a writer before. And I decided to read her books just to see what she does when she's not teaching. And I picked up a collection of stories called The Middleman and Other Stories. And it was a collection of about 9 stories about immigrants from India, from the Caribbean, from Asia, from the Philippines. And I'm Filipino. And I remember when I read her book, it was the very first time I ever saw a Filipino in a book in my entire life. And I thought, that's pretty damn amazing that here is an Indian American woman writing these make-believe stories. It was all fiction, but trying really hard to capture the different experiences of people from all over the world. People who perhaps she had some things in common with, people she probably didn't have things in common with. But what she was doing was this act of imagination. She was trying to get into the lives of these other characters and to present these really sympathetic and empathetic portraits of people wildly different from herself, yet still let the reader know that there was still this human connection. And I thought, that is an amazing thing to do. This idea that you could create a character out of almost nothing, maybe out of your own experience or maybe out of a cool news article that you came across, but this idea of trying to make something up so that someone else can read it and hopefully even care about it. I loved that idea. And I think it meant a lot to me, especially because I grew up in an immigrant household. You know, we came a family of 7 on 1 military income from the Philippines to the United States. We didn't know anybody. 5 kids to support. I was very young at the time, so my immigrant experience was fairly easy. But for my older siblings and my parents, it was quite a challenge. And reading Bharati Mukherjee's books about immigration really spoke to me on so many different levels. And I thought, I want to give this a try. This seems like a worthy pursuit. And this was my senior year in college. And so for the rest of my time in college, I took as many creative writing classes as I could. And even though, admittedly, it was an easy A, if you write the story, you get the A, I realized it was the only class that I was losing sleep over. Like, I would write a story knowing I was supposed to hand it in the next day to be read by 15 other, classmates. And I'd wake up in the middle of the night and I would think, there's got to be a better way to end that story. So I'd get up and just start rewriting. And I thought, why am I stressing out so much about this creative writing class? And I realized the reason I was stressing out so much about this class was because I cared about what I was doing. And that was something I never thought would be an option to me in college, which was to find a creative pursuit, really an artistic pursuit, because when you're writing, it's really an art. It's like painting, it's like dancing, it's like singing, it's like acting. You're trying to create something out of nothing, hoping that what you produce, whether it's a song or a play or a painting, will somehow connect with an audience. That's what I was trying to do. And I never thought that I could really make that the focus of my education. And from that point on, working with Bharati Mukherjee, who was my mentor when I was in college, I knew that I wanted to make it an integral part of my life. I wanted to make it an integral part of my education, so I took as many creative writing classes as I could. And I wanted to make it an integral part of just my life outside of school, off campus. I would go to literary readings. I would, always make a habit of going to the bookstore once every couple weeks just to see what new books were out there. And after I graduated, I realized, well, I'm sort of one of those English majors who's really not sure what he wants to do. I loved the English major. I think it honed my critical skills, my writing skills, my reading skills, but I wasn't sure what I wanted to do after graduation. So I took some time off, and I worked at an internet company in downtown San Francisco, and didn't enjoy that too much. And then I found out that you could go to graduate school and get a Master's of Fine Arts in creative writing. And I thought, hey, I'm in a position where I don't need to immediately work full time. I've paid off my loans. Why not pursue writing at the graduate degree? And I'm not saying that to be an artist of any sort, I'm not saying you have to go to school to do that. Obviously, there are hundreds and thousands of amazing artists who did not receive a formal education. But I think for me, I really wanted that sense of community. I really wanted mentorship. I wanted to be in a classroom to study this thing that I was passionate about. And when I found out that they have these programs called MFAs, Masters of Fine Arts, where you can go to school for 2 years and study this thing that you really love and be with other like-minded people. I thought, sign me up. I'm willing to leave the Bay Area, move to a small town in Oregon, and see what happens with my writing if I work at it for 2 years. And that's what I did. I realized it was the right choice for me. It's what I cared about. And after I graduated, Sarah Tunick mentioned some of these fellowships I had received. I didn't realize at the time that if you're serious about an art and you're able to produce good work and you show that you're serious about it, sometimes you can get institutions to support you. So for about 4 years, I just kind of moved around the country working on my book, finding places that would support me. I lived at a boarding school in New England for a year. I moved to Wisconsin for a year. I did 2 years at Stanford, just so I could keep working on this thing. So it was really surprising to me to learn that pursuing an art, as challenging as it can be, and I won't lie to you, I'm not saying that becoming an artist of any sort is easy, but if you're serious about it, and you can find a way to prove that you're good at it, and you have potential, there are institutions out there to support you. And I think one of the things that I think has been most surprising about sort of my journey into writing is how, I guess, what am I trying to say here? How it really proved to be, for me anyway, a viable educational and career choice. Now, I'm not saying that you should all leave here and go home and tell your parents, I'm going to be an artist. I mean, if that's what you want to do, great. But it's a very risky thing. But the thing to keep in mind is, as you're thinking about college, don't be too intimidated about the idea of choosing art as an educational avenue. If you are going to do that, if you do that, it means you will spend 4 years studying the thing that you love to do, the thing you're most passionate about. It means 4 years of studying with other artists in training who feel just the same way you do. And it's really hard in real life to find that kind of community. I didn't grow up around writers, but going to school, doing these fellowship programs, it made me realize there is a community out there. I would encourage you, if you're at all interested in writing or art or theater or dance, to pursue it at the college level. But also keep in mind that you need to have employable skills as well. So if you are going to pursue that art, make sure you have other skills as well. If you know how to code, if you are good with numbers, if you have a head for economics, pursue the double major. Have that education that feeds your humanity. Because really that's what art is. It's about communicating. I know we can all say, well, we produce art just for ourselves. That's great. But I think ultimately you're making art because you really want to communicate with somebody. Whether it's music, a book, a painting. So I would encourage you to pursue that degree in college, but also pursue the degree that will take care of you in the world. And because ultimately I think they will feed each other. Becoming a writer I think it's made me a better reader, obviously. It's made me a stronger communicator, which is a valuable skill in anything you're going to pursue at a professional level. But I think what it's really taught me is just how vital it is to communicate. I think these are I don't know how many of you are keeping track of the news these days. For me anyway, it's a little grim. Writing for me is a constant reminder that we can still communicate with one another. I feel like every time you pick up a book, you're requiring yourself to try to imagine someone else's life. And that is so important in these times when people are not being as humane to one another as we would all like. Pursuing this art has meant so much to me on a professional level, on a career level, but just really on a human level. And so I appreciate the fact that you're all here and that you've read the stories and that you're willing to, hopefully we'll have a conversation about this book, about these characters, and really about anything having to do with a writing life. So what I thought I would do right now is read a little bit from a story called Super Assassin. If you have your books with you and want to read along, I will start on page 115. And then I'm hoping after that we can have some questions and have a conversation. Yes? Great. Okay. Who here has read Super Assassin? Just curious. Okay. So for those of you who have not read Super Assassin, let me just give you a bit of background information on this story. It's about a teenager who's a little troubled. He's kind of violent. And he kind of likes to take revenge on what he sees as the injustice of the world. He is dealing with a bully named Brandon, right? Brandon. And he has a very troubled home life. So the excerpt that I'm going to read part of it takes place at his house, at his apartment that he shares with his mother. And then it takes place at school where he's about to enact a little bit of revenge on his enemy. Okay, so this is from Super Assassin, page 115, if anybody wants to follow along. On sad nights, my mother listens to her 45 of Johnny Angel over and over again until she passes out. Tonight is going to be one of those nights. Before I can even lock the door behind me, she starts screaming, asking where I've been. Nowhere, I tell her, just out. And what should I do if something happened to you out there, she asks, one hand on her hip, the other tugging at the neckline of her Las Vegas sweatshirt. What should I do then? She takes heavy, staggered breaths and begins to empty out the kitchen cupboards, throwing food we need over the fire escape, weeping and uttering profanities about men and why they are the way they are. I give her 5 quick shots of Johnny Walker and put her to bed. I take off her shoes, pull the sheets over her, and press replay on her turntable. She puts her arms around my neck and pulls my face to hers, telling me what a good boy I've been. Don't you change, she whispers. I can feel the tears on her lips wetting my ear. Go to sleep, Mom, I whisper. I pull down the shades, shutting out the last bits of daylight. She got left again. I knew my mother was feeling hopeful this time around. This guy lasted almost 4 weeks. When I warn her, she tells me I'm crazy, so this time I kept quiet. But I saw it coming. Her strategy was faulty. She had been making domestic offerings, a home-cooked meal of lumpia and pinakbet, Filipino delicacies she calls her love potions. But they lack any magical properties. Her men always see the food as alien and weird, a little too far from home, and so they take what they want and vanish. Ride a rocket to the moon, that's fine, she once slurred to some guy on the phone, but baby, won't you please come back? It was my 12th birthday, but I wasn't the one who wanted him there. I took the receiver from her hands. Accidents happen, bastard, I warned, so watch your back. She grabbed the phone, hit me with it, and then apologized for my rudeness, but he'd already hung up. Mom's messed up universe started with one bad star, a 9-month marriage to the man who was my father. He brought her to the States, a living knick-knack from his military days. Their union, brief as it was, spawned me and all my biological peculiarities. You're like Aquaman, Luke said when I told him the story. Cool. But Aquaman's mother was a mermaid, his father a human being. Nothing is human within the man who was my father. He disappeared from her life just hours before I was born. What I imagine, what I've even dreamed, is that he is a sinister breed of assassin with white hair, white skin, white eyes, invading alien streets, and sent to find my mother, then finish her off. When she's drunk, she talks about my origin, sticking the story in my head, panel after panel after panel. And then she'll break in half Johnny Angel and Johnny Walker to the rescue. But I forgive her. Like all heroes, she needs her fortress of solitude, her paradise island, any place tucked away from the evil in the world. But not to worry, I keep a lookout. In the morning, I knock on my mother's door 3 times, but she's out cold. She's already late for work, so I go into her bedroom and lay her pink waitress's uniform on a chair. I whisper goodbye, then leave for school. Luke meets me on the corner. Ready? I ask. He opens his backpack. It's all here, he says. Good, I nod. Let's go. We have our enemies. Today, Luke and I will deliver Brandon DeStefano to justice. Last week, we were reading comics at lunch on the football field bleachers when Brandon and Tenzel walked by. It's Luke the Gook, Brandon screamed. I gave him the finger, and Luke told him to run along with the other non-sentients. Non-what? Brandon said, climbing toward us. I don't understand Korean, Gook. Then Tenzel reached from behind and snatched Luke's comic book, an almost valuable issue of Swamp Thing number 12. He tossed it to Brandon, who stuffed it down the back of his pants, farted on it, then dropped it in a puddle beneath the bleachers. "Freaks," he said. Then they walked toward the lunch courtyard, a trail of sinister ha-ha-has ricocheting behind them. Luke went down to rescue the comic, but I was still watching when Brandon started twitching, his shoulder and ear crashing against each other. His spine arched him forward and back, each vertebra breaking through skin until the body was no more. And then, in a sudden flash of light, Brandon DeStefano became the gas, a force able to release methane-based emissions powerful enough to stun an enemy or wipe out an entire planet. Luke and I vowed revenge. I intend to get it. We get to school early while the boys' locker room is still empty. We find the gas's locker, and in 74 seconds, Luke picks the lock. I pull the imposter right guard deodorant from my backpack and make the switch. Later, when PE is over, Luke and I dress quickly, taking our positions by our lockers. We keep an eye out for the gas, who has just emerged from the showers. He comes closer and closer, but pays us no mind. In regular street clothes, we are anonymous, merely mortal men. The gas dries himself off and reaches into his locker for his deodorant. He shakes the can once, twice, and removes the cap. He raises his arm above his head, positioning the right guard at his armpit. Before he can spray, Luke and I vanish. The gas has no idea of the power that's about to befall him. No one ever does. First, my enemies underestimate me. Then I smash them. Thanks. I'll stop there. Thanks. I'd love to have a conversation. So I'm hoping people have questions. Excellent. This is my favorite part. I'm just going to point randomly, and I'll start with you. So you probably want to say your question loud enough for people to hear.
So in your short story, Monstress.
Okay.
In your short story, Monstress, sorry. A lot of your stories are left open-ended.
Yes.
Did you do that purposely?
So the question is, a lot of my stories end open, very openly, and did I do that on purpose? Yes, I absolutely do that on purpose. In my mind, I feel like the stories end at a right place. But as a writer, you want your reader to keep wondering about your story even after the last word. Like if you let the reader know everything that happens to your character, up until death, let's say, then the reader isn't really wondering anything anymore, right? So when you have an open ending, I think what it does is that it lets readers continue to think about the ending, and it might also inspire readers to think back at everything they've read. The more open the ending, the more open the story can become. And so therefore, if you interpret the ending one way, and you interpret the ending another way, and you interpret the ending another way, I feel like as a writer, I did my job. But if everyone here interprets the ending the exact same way, I actually think I failed. Like I tell my students, don't shut your stories down. You end them, but you don't shut them down. You want your reader to keep thinking about the story even after the final page. So that's why I try to leave it open. Let's try to jump around the room. Yes. Yeah.
Okay. How would you say your identity was projected into your stories?
How is my identity projected into my stories? My identity is very much in these pages. People often ask me if my stories are autobiographical, and I always say no, my life is not that interesting. It would make for a very boring book. But as a writer, you have to care about what you write. Otherwise, why bother, right? The emotional conflicts and tensions of this book, which have to do with identity, home, that sense of belonging, feeling beautiful, feeling ugly, I feel like those are things I've felt my whole life. All those things, and I would like to think that many people here have felt those things too. So I feel like in terms of my identity being these pages, the book is emotionally autobiographical. Not factually, but emotionally. So I think my identity is very much in all these characters. Yes, you.
Do you have any inspirations for your writing?
Do I have any inspirations for my writing? Yes. My inspiration for my writing, and this you probably would not necessarily see on the page, but I think growing up in an immigrant family and seeing the ways that my parents and my older siblings really struggled with adapting to this idea of Americanness and what it meant to be at home in America. I think that definitely inspired a lot of the writing. But in terms of my story ideas, I think I'm most inspired whenever I see these weird clashes between the Philippines, where I was born, and America. So, for example, the story about, there's a story in here called, or even Monstress, the movie, the story about making that really terrible movie. That is based on an actual movie. That is literally the cut and paste of a horrible American film and a horrible Filipino film. It's called The Horror of the Blood Monsters. It's terrible. It's like the worst movie you've ever seen. And I thought, wow, this kind of speaks to what I'm interested in as a writer. I think dramatically it's interesting, but thematically, it combines Filipino culture and American culture, and that kind of clash, that kind of tension, is something, as a Filipino American, I'm interested in as a human being. So to find this story from real life and then to turn it into fiction, I love that process. Most of this book happened that way. Red headband? Yeah.
Why do you think it was so important for you to write this book? As what you were hoping to get your audience members?
So why did I think it was important for me to write this book? You know, writers sometimes say, write the book that you wish you could read. I don't necessarily know that this would be the first book I take off a bookshelf if I want something to read, but I do know growing up, I did not see, it's not so much seeing myself, but I didn't see a lot of Filipino characters, a lot of Filipino experiences. Not that there's only one Filipino experience, obviously, but just different Filipino experiences. I never saw that in books, and I certainly don't see it in movies or TV shows. And so when I saw that Filipino character in the book The Middleman by Barati Mukherjee, who I mentioned earlier, that meant a lot to me. It really did, and I thought, I want to be part of that conversation. These stories are not about me, but I want these weird make-believe stories about Filipinos and Filipino Americans. I want that to be in the world. So I think that's why I wrote the book. You with a cap? Yes.
What's the purpose of the cover art?
Purpose of the cover. Okay, so most writers, when they're working with a publisher, they do not have any say in the cover art, unfortunately. But they did give me a couple of options. This was one of them. They just wanted my feedback. I'm like, okay, yeah, it looks good. But I guess, oh yeah, it probably, this is a reference to the parrot in the book. Then I realized there is no parrot in the book. And so what I realized what they were doing, or this is sort of my interpretation, I think they wanted something really beautiful, like this bird, but they wanted to present it in a weird way. And it is weirdly presented. It's upside down. If you turn it over and look at the way that it's cropped, there's no beak to the bird. So it kind of looks like a weird kind of Harry Potter kind of creature, right? To me, I think that this upside down image of this bird kind of represents one of the themes in the book, which is encountering something that at first might seem strange, but is also beautiful. But the opposite, which is you encounter something beautiful, but it's also strange and weird too. And I think the act of immigration, which is consistent in this book, I think that can sort of be a similar experience. You come to a new place and it's weird and it's difficult and alien, and then it eventually might turn into something or a place that you love. To me, that's why this cover is the way it is. Of course, I'm making all this up. I have no idea what the artist intended, but I like to think about it that way. You up there with a puffy coat?
Do you have any projects that you're working on now that we should be looking out?
I am working on a novel, which is due to my publisher in about a year. I've been working on it a long time. I hope I get it done. It's about scam artists. And it takes place in Northern California, mostly. So, yeah, look for it. You right there. Yes. Okay.
How did you choose which stories would have named or unnamed characters? And,
Okay.
what is the significance of someone's name?
Okay, names are very hard. I think if you talk to a lot of writers, it's very difficult to name characters. There are a couple of stories here where the characters have no names. Super Assassin, for example, has no name. And the reason, in that particular instance, the reason that I did not want to name the narrator is because to me, it felt like it fit the theme of the story. This is a kid who's obsessed with superheroes. Superheroes have secret identities, so he never wants to really reveal himself. So I thought, why not imitate that sense of secrecy for the reader by not naming the narrator? But other stories, names are really important. I don't know if you read a story in there called Felix Starro. I really wanted to have a kind of weird mystical name. I like the X, I like the fact that star is in Starro, so that felt like it fit the story thematically. So whether or not I name the characters, it really has to do with what I think the story is really about. You right here.
What would you say is the most significant theme in your book?
Oh, gosh. Home. Home. I think home is the most significant theme in the book. Yes.
So, which story do you think was the hardest for you to write?
The hardest story, and I was talking to Sarah about this earlier, the hardest story in this book to write was Lemoore, California. If you look at the other stories, they're kind of strange. They take place in a leper colony. They're about the Beatles. They're about superheroes, monster movies. Lemoore, California is about a family immigrating to America. It's a story that takes place every single day. It's so ordinary that the ordinariness of it made it difficult. Writing that, I was thinking, where are the superheroes? Where are the Beatles? I don't know how to write the story. But I cared about it, and I couldn't let it go. I worked on that story, and I worked on other stories in the meantime, but I worked on that story on and off for over 10 years to get it right. And the reason, and I don't know why I did that, except all I can say is that I cared about those characters, and I just wanted to keep going. You. Yes?
Can you see your books ever being made into movies?
Can I see my books ever being made into movies or TV shows? Two of these stories, Monstress and Save the I Hotel, were produced and staged about 2 years ago at the American Conservatory Theater in downtown San Francisco, and that was really cool. It ran for about 3 months, and it was amazing. I didn't write it, but it was really, I would go to rehearsal, and it was amazing to see the interpretations of directors and playwrights and actors bring these stories to life in their own way. Felix Starro has been turned into a musical. They're looking for a theater in New York. I'm hoping they'll find one. Actually a Philippine filmmaker, I just wrote my agent today about film options, is trying to make a movie out of the story Monstress. So I have actually seen them staged or adapted in some way, and that's been really exciting. Yes, you.
How has your family, how have they reacted to the type of stories that you wrote, especially with the Filipino culture, and I think how it was described, or how the Filipino culture was described in the book, and how they reacted to certain, I don't know, events happening.
Okay.
Just kind of reflect on that.
Sure. So the question is how my family responded to the book. I did not come from a family of artists. All my siblings were older than me. They're professionals. They drive nice cars and live in big houses, things like that. Whoa, what's that?
Please call extension 116. Martha Hawkins, please call extension 116.
Someone needs to call extension 116. My family, so they don't, they're not writers, and they're, to be honest, not a lot of them are readers, but they were very supportive. They knew, I think what really meant a lot to me is that they knew that I worked hard on this book, and I put everything I had into this book. And so they were there for readings and making all their friends buy this book. My mother, who is not with me anymore, she dropped out of school in the 6th grade in the Philippines. So my mother did not have a formal education. She could speak English pretty decently, but she literally would not have been able to read this book. But I remember when the book came out, my sister took her to Barnes & Noble in San Diego. And when my mom saw the book on the bookshelf, she started crying. And I thought, my mother loves a book that she can't even read. And to me, that's the best response I could ever get. Yeah. Yeah.
What advice would you give to those who want to improve their creative writing skills?
Those who want to improve their creative writing skills, read a lot and read lots of different things. If you like to read one particular kind of story, read another kind of story. And I always say this, if you want to be a writer, people say, I've got a great story to tell. Being a storyteller and being a writer are two different things. If you want to be a storyteller, there's like open mic night at a cafe, you can tell a story. And that's a great skill. If you want to be a writer, I really think you have to care about language. And you have to care about sentences. We can all tell the same story, but we can only write it in our own unique ways. So if you are a creative writer and want to improve your skills, really think about your sentences and read a lot. Yes, you.
You said Mount Rushmore, Oregon, Wisconsin, all those places. How did that help you in writing?
How did moving around a lot help me with my writing? I think what it taught me to do was to be able to work in any one situation. I think constantly changing locations is actually really good for my writing. There are these things called writer's residencies where you can go away to like the woods in New Hampshire. You get a little cabin and just sit there all day and write. I love leaving my life in order to write. And I think being forced to move all over the country has shown me how important adaptability is in being able to work. Yes, you, yeah.
Which story in Monstress do you identify with the most?
Lemoore, California. Because I think, as I said before, it's so ordinary, it's so common. I think that's probably why it was so hard, actually, to be honest. Let's see, you with the yellow O, 0? Yeah, you. What's that?
Who's your favorite author and why?
Okay, I don't have one favorite author, but an author who I love is a writer named Kazuo Ishiguro, who recently got the Nobel Prize. He wrote a book called The Remains of the Day about the life of an English butler, but then he'll write a weird, almost like sci-fi book about clones. And he always writes different kinds of books, but they're always really good. And you can see how that very human concern about relationships and looking back on life, it's consistent throughout. Even though the plots and the characters are wildly different from one another, you can still see the emotional concerns coming through, and I admire that. And that's kind of something I aspire to do, even just with this book. Up there, light blue, yeah, you.
My name's Alex. Just a quick question. Have you ever experienced writer's block, and how did you deal with it?
Writer's block is practically my roommate. It's tough. It's really tough. A lot of the way, sometimes I deal with it. Here's if you're writing and you're stuck, one thing I do is I'll go for a walk and I'll ask myself, if I'm going on this walk, let's say I'm working on a particular story on a particular character, what would this character notice on this walk? Because when I'm going down the street, I would notice different things than something one of my characters would notice. And just by trying to get into the minds of your characters, then you start getting more into that writing frame of thinking. So I often go for a walk. Sometimes I read. Reading sometimes really helps, even if it's just like an article or something. But leaving my workspace is a great way to try to get back into the writing. Thank you. You right there, up there. Yes. Yeah.
So what's the most money that you've ever made on a book?
Not enough. Never enough.
So a common theme that I found in the book was alienation. I just wanted to know or that's me personally, but I felt like, did that come from you or did that come from outside influences?
So you noticed a theme of alienation in the book, and you want to know where that came from. I think it came from me, and it came from other people that I know. I mean, I think growing up in an immigrant family, to some extent, that feeling of alienation is always there. If not always, at least at the beginning, because you're in a new place. I think seeing my siblings and my parents deal with it in their own different ways, I think definitely influenced, my frame of mind. Yes, you.
What is your favorite piece of work, and what do you think separates it from your other pieces?
My favorite piece of work. I'll just limit it to the stories in this book. I would say my favorite story, Super Assassin was the most fun to write, but probably my favorite story is Lemoore, California, because it was so difficult, and it's not autobiographical, but it feels very close. How about you in the light blue shirt?
Is there any reason that you put the stories in the order that they're in?
Yeah, absolutely, and I worked with my editor on doing that. I wanted my, if I had a reader and the reader read every story in order, I wanted them to read one story, finish it, and to enter the next story kind of unprepared. So like you finish a story like Monstress, which is kind of funny and weird, and then you get to a story like The Brothers, which basically opens with a death. It's very dark and very quiet. And then you have, a couple stories later, you have Super Assassin, which is so weird. And at the end, you have something very ordinary, like a family coming to America. I kind of wanted that sort of roller coaster experience. So that's why I put it in the order the way I did. You right there, Blue Hood, I think. Yes?
What inspired you when you were writing Super Assassin?
What inspired me? That story began with a writing exercise in graduate school where we had to write from the point of view of a young person. But as I kept writing it, I realized I'm really tapping into sort of my love of comic books from when I was a kid. And I really love this idea that superheroes have two identities. And I feel like having two identities is a tension or conflict that can be inherent to an immigrant experience. I think anyone who's leaving home and then moving to a new place has different identities. And I felt like that superhero idea was a good metaphor for the story as a whole. You right there.
I was wondering, in the excerpt from the book you wrote, I was wondering why they disrespected his comic book and like farted on it.
Because he's a jerk. Because Brandon he's a real jerk, and he doesn't understand that these kids really care about what he thinks might be silly.
Now we have time for some raffle prizes from your dear librarian. I'm going to ask Mr. Tenorio to pick one of these raffle tickets and read the number, and you can check to see if you have the number on your raffle ticket, and if you do, come on up.
All right. So 8783 158.
Oh my God!
Here's the next one. 8783 134. Here's another.
Third period.
8783 192. Nobody? Nope. Do a different one.
Come on.
8783 030.
Come on, bro.
Yes.
Oh,
878-3172. All right, last one. 878-3159.
Hey, run it back, one more.
3159.
And can you give him a huge round